They go on the
Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? I tend to speak loud, but I can move this closer.
A little bit quiet.
It's a little bit quiet? Okay. If I speak really loud, is that good? Everyone can hear?
It's working.
It's not working.
You just gotta.
All right, I will hold the mic. How's that?
That's
Fantastic. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brianna Fitzpatrick. I'm the liaison to the UN for Caritas Internationalis, one of the 3 organizers of today's events, with our co-host Fordham University and Catholic Relief Services, or CRS. It's really been a pleasure to organize the event with our co-host. It has been really easy, smooth sailing, which is kind of has me nerve-wracked this morning. Like, is something gonna go wrong at the last minute? But it's fine. We made it all here. Nicole held off for a while, or at least for a few hours more. And it's just so nice to see this room so full again, excuse me, after coming out of our COVID cocoons. But my question is, why are we all here? And I think some of you may be interested in class credit, which is fine. Some of you may be interested in food and free caffeine. I know that's helpful to me. We had an early morning. Some of you may be really interested in the Pope Francis Poverty Index, which was built out of the facets of Pope Francis's speech at the UN in 2015. Some of you might be here to hear about the very needed pathways for the poor and most vulnerable in the era of climate change from Bill O'Keefe. But I think if you put all of those things together in a Venn diagram, the overlap is very clear. We're here because we all believe in making the world a better place. And I think that's a wonderful overlap to bring us together, to energize the room. And I'm also very honored to work for an organization that embodies that. I tend to brag about Caritas. I'm in my honeymoon stage with them. I onboarded in January. So please indulge me for a moment as I tell you a bit more about them. Caritas Internationalis is the confederation of Catholic charities and the humanitarian heart of the Catholic Church, serving in over 200 countries and territories with our 165 member organizations. At the local, national, regional, and international level, Caritas's work is guided by the deep moral and spiritual principles of dignity, justice, solidarity, and stewardship. One of our members is Catholic Relief Services, and they embody that and exemplify that so well. And beyond our membership, we also have the opportunity to have strategic partnerships in the field and at places like the UN, such as with Fordham here today. And together we have a great morning in store for you, like I said, with the index, with the climate change, and also with a light lunch. So you do have to stay for that part. And we'll start with remarks from His Excellency Archbishop Kacha, the Apostolic Nuncio to the Holy See, who's going to tell you more about the World Day of the Poor. But before he does that, I'll tell you a little bit more about him as well. The Archbishop was born in Milan, in Italy. Did you know your staff put the year?
Not interested,
Okay.
but you can skip everything. All right.
Ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of Milan, a doctorate in sacred theology from the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy in Rome, a licentiate in canon law from the Pontifical Gregorian University, and joined the diplomatic service in 1991, serving in Tanzania at the Secretariat of State and the General Affairs section of the Secretariat of State, also in Lebanon and the Philippines, and most recently appointed by His Holiness Pope Francis as the permanent observer of the Holy See to the United Nations in New York in November of 2019. We are so blessed to have you with us here this morning, Your Excellency, and the floor is yours.
I'm so happy to be with you this morning. My duty is very simple: to introduce this World Day of the Poor. Most probably none of you have heard of that. I assume well, very well. So that's why I have to introduce. This is a new thing. It's the 6th edition, means that it started in which year? Was 17 the first year in which we celebrated. How it came to mind to have this idea? Okay, it's related to Pope Francis. Do you know that when there was the conclave is the time when the cardinals elect the new Pope. So according to what Pope Francis said himself, because no one is allowed to talk about what happens in the conclave, except the one who's elected, he can do whatever he wants. So he said, at a certain moment, my name came to be repeated. They had to scrutiny. Jorge Bergoglio, Jorge Bergoglio, Jorge Bergoglio. So they understood that the thing became serious. And close to him, there was another cardinal from Brazil, Cardinal Hummes, that has recently died. And when he realized that most probably his friend was to be elected, he told him, don't forget the poor. And then things continued. They continued. And when they reached the number, the 2/3 required, there was a big applause, but it was not yet finished. It continued because there were still other votes to be checked. And in the meantime, he has to decide which name he would take, because he's Jorge, George, by baptism. But when you are elected, I hope some of you will be elected one day, Pope. When you are elected a Pope, they ask you, what name do you want to take? And so he said, Francis. And why Francis? they asked him, since he's a Jesuit, is Francis Xavier, a great missionary? He said, no, it's Francis of Assisi. Maybe you have heard about him. And he said, I chosen Francis because of the poor. He was the son of a rich merchant. He could have done whatever he wanted in life. But then he decided to give up everything and start a life of penance. After meeting with a leper, and after being also in jail because he was to go to fight, but he lost, he was in jail and so on for many years. Okay, because of the poor. And then he said, but Francis is also the person that during the crusade time decided to go and meet the Sultan, not with weapons, but just unharmed with words. And he met in Damietta, the Sultan, and they spent time together, and then he let him go back. So he was a man of peace, poor peace. And third, he said, I've chosen Francis because he was the one who praised the creation. Laudato Si is a very famous poem, the first literature piece of art in Italian language. Brother Sun, Sister Moon, this is very famous. So the environment. And he said, in the name, there are three goals of my pontificate: the poor, peace, and environment. So that was 2013. He was elected that time. And then, as you know, you don't know, also this is another thing that you don't know. Every 25 years in the Catholic Church, there is a so-called Holy Year or a Jubilee. It started some centuries ago. The first one tracked back in 1300. And people go to Rome, and it tracks back to the origin of the ancient Testament. He said that after a certain number of years, there will be a Jubilee year. You have to give back the land to those who have sold to you. You have to take care of the poor. You have to not to work too much because the land also needs to rest and so on. So there is this tradition. So the last great Jubilee was in the year 2000. That means that the next great Jubilee, Holy Year, will be in the year 25. We are approaching. But he decided to have a special Jubilee year that was called the Year of Mercy, because he thought that this world is going bankruptcy. And what is missing is this attitude, mercy, which means empathy, which means taking care. And so he wanted this year of mercy. And in this year of mercy, he stressed the importance of what we call the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. So this corporal, to feed the hungry, it comes from the gospel, but to feed the hungry, to give drink to the thirsty, to clothe the naked, to give shelter to the travelers or homeless, to visit the sick, to visit the imprisoned, to bury the dead. These are in the tradition of the church, always. Those who want to follow Jesus are invited to do these things. But it's not just material poverty. There are also the spiritual work of mercy, to instruct the ignorant, to counsel the doubtful, to admonish sinners, to bear wrongs patiently, to forgive offenses willingly, to comfort the afflicted, to pray for the living and the dead. So that was a special year. And there were many, many good things that happened. Usually in the Jubilee year, they open a special door, which is open only every 25 years in St. Peter's Basilica. It's called the Holy Door, Porta Santa. But he decided that since no one, or not everyone can go to Rome, especially the church is big all over the world, he decided to do something very innovative. In each diocese, they had to choose a special church and have a special door. It's a symbol, so that every faithful people could do this act, which is, as you enter or exit the door, mean that you are making something different. You enter in a new atmosphere and you exit with a renewed spirit. This is the image, more or less. And during that year, every Sunday, there was also something important in Rome. The last Sunday, he wanted to meet all the marginalized. And when he was preaching that last Sunday of 2016, he said, in the light of these reflections, I would like today to be the day of the poor, because he have listened to the stories of these people he have met before. So he got this idea, and the following week, he made a document called Misericordia et Misera, in which he said, I had the idea that as yet another tangible sign of this extraordinary holy year, the entire church might celebrate on the 33rd Sunday of ordinary time, which is this Sunday, the World Day of the Poor. It would be a day to help communities and each of the baptized to reflect on how poverty is at the very heart of the gospel, and that as long as Lazarus lies at the door of our homes, there can be no justice or social peace. And that's started this initiative. And every year he sent a message for this Sunday, special Sunday. There is a message, you will receive the message at the end, so I don't have to read everything very well. And you can read it and also start thinking of this message. But the Holy Father is reminding us that there are a kind of 3 steps in his message. The first step is to reject, as I quote, any form of laxity that leads to incoherent behavior, such as indifference to the poor. The Holy Father said, in this world of globalization, what is more globalized is unfortunately indifference. And this is an appeal this Day of the Poor, not to be indifferent. If we have to eat, doesn't mean that everyone has to eat. If we have to drink, doesn't mean that everyone has to drink. So many forms. But since we are all right, okay, that's their problem. That becomes indifference. And when become indifferent, things go wrong for the poor, but it's a circle. Everything is interconnected. So first step, to win indifference. Second step, how do you win indifference? In practice term. It's just that, okay, I'm not indifferent now, okay. So there is something missing, no? What is the second step? You see somebody who has no to eat. I'm not indifferent, so give to eat. So what is in big term, we call that solidarity, or in another way, sharing. If you are not indifferent, you start sharing. And this sharing could have many forms. The simple one, you don't have a toy, a boy, okay, we'll play together. You don't know how to do this homework, okay, I help you. You don't have to eat some kitchen. But in the economic, in the social, in the political, what does it mean? Sharing, solidarity. So there is plenty to do. And the third step, these are very good. We are very happy to do this. Good idea, wonderful. You do 1 day, 2 days, and then you get bored because it's demanding. So the third step, the Pope says, look always at the one who didn't stop doing this, and is Jesus. Jesus is the model. He was like God, nothing missing. He decided to become man, to be hungry, thirsty, unjustly accused, persecuted, killed. If we don't enter into this kind of mentality, if we don't keep our eyes fixed on him, we can be easily discouraged and we give up after a while. Oh, I've done that, and I don't say even thank you. Jesus did that and no one said him thank you. On the contrary, they crucified him. So if we don't keep his eyes on Jesus, that we believe is the revelation of God, but all the religion, after all, have these perceptions that God is mercy, that God cares, that God is with the suffering. Also, we have the honor to have the ex-PGA of Nigeria, my dear friend, and they always start in the name of God, the merciful, the merciful. Everyone who is deeply religious has something to do with this, looking at the mystery of God. And this is the source of our engagement. And so this is, in very short term, the message of the Pope. But you will read, and it's much better said by him than by me. Two last considerations. You belong to many very good, important associations, and I want to thank you also, Caritas Internationalis, and also Catholic Relief Service. And to be precise, not just for them, but I have to read very well. The graduate program in international political economy and development of the Fordham University, which is IPAD, correct? Very well. So you look at things also in a professional way, and there are so many forms of poverty. But we have an attitude to do something for the poor. Wonderful. But the Pope says it's not enough. You have to do something, not just for the poor. Don't worry, I'm here now, I give you all, well, I organize this and that. But do something with the poor. That means we are not talking. We should talk about data and statistics, and I'm very grateful for what will be presented now, because it's opened our eyes. But there is always a personal touch. Otherwise, we are talking about something which is distant. So not just doing something for the poor, but with them. And maybe we will learn from them how to do things differently. So this is my wish, that this meeting today will help to be a better person, because when we are a better person, we are happy. And this is very important in life, to be happy, because St. Francis, in spite of his poverty, giving up all the riches, he was always happy. And is well known for this spirit of joy, even in very difficult circumstances. So the invitation is to study, to see what can we do at different level, at the university level, at the political level, at the economic level, the financial level, on the ground, but also not to miss the opportunity to do something also which is much personal. For instance, if you look around Manhattan or the place where you live, there are many poor. But the good news is that there are so many people taking care of them. So why for this Sunday or this weekend, don't go and see what, for instance, Sisters for Life do to encourage young women with problems, with maternity, or to go to the Sister of Mother Teresa, what they do for the elderly, for the handicapped. Elizabeth Seton Sisters, their center. There are so many good initiatives, Soup Kitchen in the parishes, so many things. Don't let them be a business of somebody else. Be engaged and you will find peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Archbishop Caccia, you've started us off with both education and inspiration. And that leads us into our next portion, the release of the 2022 issue of Fordham University's Pope Francis Global Poverty Index, which will be presented by two people. We have Dr. Henry Schwalbenberg, if I said it correctly.
Yes.
Okay. Associate Professor of Economics at Fordham University. Dr. Schwalbenberg is an associate professor, I just said that, of economics at Fordham University, at Fordham's graduate program in international political economy and development. Thank you for that correction as well. He has been a Fulbright Fellow to Asia and to Africa and is a graduate of Columbia University, earning a Bachelor of Science, a Master's of International Affairs, and a PhD in economics, a true academic, no? And the second presenter will be Ms. Maria Alejandra Hincape. Yes, a graduate student at IPED and an international political economy and development at Fordham University. Once again, she has been a program assistant at UNDP's Nature for Development, and prior to this has served as a Peace Corps primary English literary specialist in Grenada. In 2017, she graduated with a BBA from Adelphi University. I'm from Long Island, so very happy to hear that. So I will pass it off to the both of you to present the index.
Thank you, Brianna, for your kind introduction. And I also want to thank Archbishop Caccio for his opening remarks. And I think we will have it's there on the front row, but at some point we need to get it to the back so people can pick it up. The Pope's message for this, for the World Day of the Poor. As you know, my name is Henry Schwalbenberg. Besides teaching at Fordham, I'm also the editor of Fordham's Pope Francis Global Poverty Index. And as you know, joining me today is Maria, who just instructed me on how to hold the microphone. In January, she will be starting a 6-month field placement in Rwanda with Catholic Relief Services. And I think we have 2 others in the room that are going to do something similar. So let's begin the presentation. The main result of this year's report is that extreme global poverty is the worst it has been since we started issuing this report 7 years ago in 2016. We find that this increase in extreme global poverty is due to 4 factors: undernourishment, lack of above subsistence level employment, gender inequity in health and survival rates, and restrictions on religious freedom. Since the effects of the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine are not yet fully reflected in our data, the actual situation today might even be worse on the ground.
Our measure of extreme global poverty is based on the concept of integral human development, as drawn from the writings of Pope Paul VI and his friend, the philosopher Jacques Maritain. Integral human development argues that in order to live a full, integrated, and dignified life, humans need a range of both material goods and spiritual freedoms. Based on this concept, Pope Francis, when he visited the United Nations in 2015, suggested that to understand extreme global poverty, we needed to track 7 important indicators. 4 of these indicators are access to very basic material goods that we need just to survive and live: water, food, housing, and employment. The remaining 3 indicators are critical spiritual freedoms, non-tangible goods that we need to guide our own lives: education, civil liberties, and religious freedom.
Following the Pope's suggestions, we have developed Fortum's Pope Francis Global Poverty Index, which has proven to be a unique measure of human well-being because of its focus on both extreme material poverty and the lack of critical spiritual freedoms. This morning, we will review the 7 different components of the index and then conclude with the determination of our global poverty score for the year 2022. Maria will now review the different components of the index by looking at what might be the most fundamental physical human need we have: access to water.
From the Joint Monitoring Program of the World Health Organization and UNICEF, we obtained data on the percentage of the nation's population that lacked access to drinking water from an approved source, such as a well, within the 30-minute period. Looking at the graph projected on the screen, you can see that the number of people lacking access to drinking water has consistently declined from 2013 until 2020, the year of the pandemic. Still, based on this most recently available data, roughly 10% of the world's population, or just over 750 million people, lack basic access to water. Dr. S. will now look at the other fundamental physical need that we track in the Fortum Francis Index: access to food.
The UN Food and Agriculture Organization produces data on the percentage of a country's population who are currently unable to consume enough food to meet their dietary energy requirements. You can see on the graph that initially the number of undernourished people declined. But starting around 2016, the number of people suffering from undernourishment began to constantly increase. Due to conflicts, climate change, and COVID, many expect this trend to continue to worsen even further in the future. And as many of you know, there was an alert sent out last week about the, I don't know whether to say expected or possibility of famine in the Horn of Africa. But for the most recent year of data, about 9% of the world's population lacks basic access to food. This means that just under 750 million people are continuously undernourished. Maria will now describe one of the most foundational social goods needed to sustain families: access to housing.
We obtained our data on inadequate housing from the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. Housing is defined as inadequate if flooring consists of dirt or dung, or if walls or roofs are missing, or if walls or roofs are made from discarded materials such as cardboards or plastics. As you can see, the graph indicates that since 2016, when Oxford adopted their current definition on inadequate housing, there seems to be no clear trend up or down. According to the data that's most recently available, nearly 20% of the world's population, or about 1.25 billion people, lived in inadequate housing. Dr. S. will now look at employment, perhaps the most foundational social good needed to communities.
Using data from the International Labor Organization, we calculated the distressed labor rate. The distressed labor rate includes the percentage of the labor force that is either unemployed or employed earning less than $3.20 a day. The International Labor Organization argues that without outside assistance, the lives of workers earning less than $3.20 a day are at risk. In the graph before you, you can see that since 2013, the situation has continuously improved until the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020. There has been a partial recovery in 2021. As of last year, about a quarter of the world's labor force, or just over 750 million people, were unable to meet their basic livelihood needs through employment. We will now look at 4 heat maps showing how the lack of access to water, food, housing, and employment are distributed geographically around the globe. The darkest areas on the maps show where the lack of access to these 4 basic material needs are most extreme. You can see that the lack of access to these 4 basic material needs are highly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in a few other countries, such as Afghanistan, Haiti, and Venezuela. Summarizing our material welfare indicators, we can see that the deterioration in access to food and the lack of access to above subsistence level employment are 2 factors increasing extreme global poverty. Maria will now begin our review of spiritual freedoms, non-tangible goods, by looking at education, a good well known for its ability to empower people to transform their own lives.
From UNESCO, we obtained data on the adult illiteracy rate. The adult illiteracy rate is the percentage of a nation's population above the age of 15 who cannot read, write, or comprehend a simple statement about ordinary life. Looking at the graph before you, you can see that from the most part, from 2013 until 2020, the global adult illiteracy rate declined. Yet, for the data most recently available, about 750 million people are considered illiterate. Dr. S. will now look at gender equity, a critical civil liberty that by definition can affect half of the world's population.
Our data on gender equity comes from the World Economic Forum and their Health and Survival Index. The Health and Survival Index measures the gap between the expected healthy lifespan of females versus males, as well as the sex ratio at birth to capture the phenomenon of missing women. As shown in the graph, there was an initial reduction in the gender gap in 2014, but since that time, the health and survival situation of women relative to men has deteriorated, and it has become in 2021 worse than what it was in 2013. We estimate that roughly half of the world's female population, roughly 2 billion people, live in countries where the risk to their health and survival is severe. Maria will now look at the last spiritual good suggested by Pope Francis, religious freedom, a right championed by both the Second Vatican Council and the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Our data on religious freedom comes from the Pew Research Center and their Government Restrictions Index. The Government Restrictions Index is a compilation of 20 measures of restrictions, such as bans on particular faiths or preferential treatment to one or more religious groups. Viewing the graph before us, you will see that starting in 2017, the world experienced a significant increase in religious restrictions. We estimate that more than half of the world's population, about 4.5 billion people, live in countries where religious freedom is highly restricted. We will now look at 3 heat maps showing how illiteracy, the female health and survival gap, and government restrictions on religious freedom are distributed geographically around the world. The darkest areas of the map show where the lack of education, gender equity, and religious freedom are most extreme. You can see that the lack of access to these 3 critical spiritual freedoms are highly concentrated in Asia and North Africa, especially in the cases of gender equity and religious freedom. Summarizing our spiritual freedom indicators, we can see that the deterioration in the health and survival rate of females relative to males, as well as the increase in government restrictions on religious freedom, have significantly contributed to an increase in our measure of extreme global poverty. Dr. S. will now conclude our presentation.
Integral human development is concerned about both material and spiritual human goods that people need in order to live in dignity. In the Fordham-Francis Index, we measured 7 dimensions of human well-being. 4 are some of the most basic material goods that people need in order to just survive. And 3 are some of the most critical spiritual freedoms needed to empower people to be able to transform their lives. Based on the most recently available data, we found that serious gaps exist in all 7 dimensions. They range from a low of roughly 9% to a high of 59% of the world's population. The average of all 7 gaps is the global poverty score. Based on the latest available data, the global poverty score is currently 26.2%. Due to declines in 4 indicators: access to food, employment, gender equity, and religious freedom, this year's global poverty score is the worst score we have seen since 2016, when the index was first created.
Thank you all for your kind attention. To request a written copy of this presentation, please email us at iped@fordham.edu. You will also be able to view recordings of today's presentation on Fordham IPED's YouTube channel. At this time, we will now welcome your questions and critiques. Thank you.
Question, raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. But I'll start us off asking, why do you think it's important to include these spiritual indicators when the countries like India and China, which we've seen the greatest reduction in material poverty, do not perform well on these spiritual indicators? How do you answer that contradiction?
Okay, that's me to answer it, right?
Sure.
Okay, so I think this is at the heart, I think this is at the heart of whether you like this index or don't like this index. So, for example, across the street is the UN Development Program, and they have a Human Development Index, which has 3 components, one of which is economic per capita income. And we find that a lot of these 4 things are very similar to that. Another one is life expectancy, and another one is education. But when it comes to civil liberties and like religious freedom or gender equity, we don't have those things usually. So why do you put that in? Now, we have philosophers and theologians in the audience that probably can do a better explanation of why Jacques Maritain thinks integral human development is the way to go and why the spiritual stuff is so important. But I'll just give the one that we focus on here, and that was the idea of empowerment, that if we're going to empower people to have something to say about their own lives, then they need the freedom to do that. And that's, I guess, very similar to what the Archbishop said about, and then some other one said about something about by bread alone, we shall not live, but I think I covered the basis. But I think it's a real philosophical debate. I think there are many people who would argue that if you want to talk about extreme poverty, you only look at these things on the bottom and not the things on the top. And I think there are some people who say in some societies that this is, you're on your own when it comes to this, and the political system only ensures the political rights. And so and so in the UN system, you have a UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and you also have Sustainable Development Goals, and the overlap is not that strong. Some overlap, but not too much.
Hi, so I have a question, and that is, you selected to frame it as extreme poverty. And I'm wondering how your Francis Global Poverty Index compares with the multidimensional poverty index from Oxford's Poverty and Human Development Institute. In particular, because they do include some of the spiritual and why in a sense why you picked extreme, but also how did your numbers line up with Oxford's conception of multidimensional poverty, and how good or bad we're doing as a population?
Sure. Okay, so the first part is, do it again, why?
So why did, right, so for those who don't know, Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, they have moved from talking about extreme poverty to talking about multidimensional poverty as a way of capturing not just
Sure.
those who are have just not, lack of income. or lack
So the first question is why extreme? Okay, but it's not a trade-off, it's extreme and multidimensional.
That's what
So-
the question.
So it's multidimensional because we're trying to look at very basic human needs, water, food, and you could come up maybe with some more. Basic social needs for families, housing, for communities, employment. And then basic, let's call them empowering needs, educational, human capital, some people like to call it. Not just gender equity, but other civil liberties, and then religious freedom or freedom of conscience, those kind of things. So this is multidimensional, where we lack compared to Oxford. Oxford is able to do household surveys, and they identify they can identify a household usually, and they can say, you suffer from this, this, and that, and so you count that, so they can measure the intensity of poverty. We can't. We can only say, we think, you notice in the report, the number, 750 million people kept coming up when we were talking about water, food, and many other things. I think those are the same 750 million people, but we don't have household surveys that we can, we don't have that micro, we're doing a macro level, they're doing more micro level. The other thing, extreme, why we do extreme is we're trying to match Pope Francis's bias, I guess, towards the marginal and those living on the periphery. So for example, across the street, when they do education, I believe they do years completed. We do illiteracy rates. So something that very basic. Undernourishment, you don't have enough to survive. Our measure of employment is not just unemployment, it's employment so that you can't even earn enough to survive. Housing is your floor is made of dung and dirt, and you're lacking walls, or it's just some cardboard or something. So we try to, and we're also on, so we try to be more extreme in our measures. So that's one thing.
Point number one, thank you so much. This is really very revelatory. Point number two, quick questions. You weight all equally, but my big question is, what happened? Can you give us some examples of why gender has jumped, fallen so precipitously?
Let's do the simple stuff. The last one is a tough one. You're not going to get a good answer, so I'll just prepare you for that. Future, maybe next year, come back with that one. But we weigh them more equally, but I don't think the world does. And so there's this thing called reveal preferences. You look at people's actions and they reveal their preferences. So I think the world has revealed that food and water are the most high priority. Then a second level of priority might be housing and education. A third level of priority is employment. And the last level of priority, based on the reality revealed in the numbers, is religious freedom, gender, and probably other civil liberties. So there is a hierarchy of values revealed by the results. But in our score, we're holding everything equal. And so again, that's a philosophical decision to be made by the, who you are, what your values are. So we're holding the spiritual as the same, well, we're saying all these are equal, and then people can disagree, and the world disagrees. Clearly, the world disagrees with that. To answer your question of what happened in the gender, I don't know. That measure comes from the World Economic Forum. And you'll notice that 1 year of data is missing. There's this big decline in 1 year. Is that an error in their reporting mechanisms? Or should we be just looking at the trend over time to be more confident in those numbers? We don't know. We wanted to get those folks to come and talk to us about how they put their numbers together. And I'll just, another mention on numbers. The numbers, when we go talk, say, about food, they go back to the UN Food and Agricultural Organization. Those guys have been doing it forever. Very solid numbers. When we start looking at equities, gender equity, it's a new concept. And people are just trying to, we're just at the beginning of getting numbers on these. Well, for example, religious freedom, governments don't do that. Well, you'll get a State Department report, but it's the Pew Research Foundation that does it. And so we have some stuff where we have really great data for since the end of World War II, and other stuff, people are just working on it. I think we're running, we need to make that the last question, right? Because we have to get to the keynote speaker.
Thank you very much for the great work. Bearing in mind what Archbishop Cox said about Pope Francis' focus on peace and the conflicts in Ukraine and Afghanistan, I'm wondering if for future years there's been any consideration of expanding the index to include an indicator for people living free of areas that are experiencing violent conflict or anything of that nature.
I'll tell you what we're thinking of doing, and may fit that, may not. In the report, you'll see that we see how these things are related to the Sustainable Development Goals. What we're thinking of doing is see how they relate to the different rights in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then this is a nice thing to tie into the park that lies on the other side of the building, the Four Freedoms Park. And as you know, one of the key 4 freedoms is freedom from fear. And so that would be somewhere up here. So I'll end with that and turn it over to Brianna.
Thank you so much. Congratulations to Fordham's graduate students and professor for putting this index together, for doing really the hard work so that we're able to read it in this wonderful report that breaks it down for us in a really digestible way. You could see it on your run of show that you were supposed to have a break from 10:45 to 11. So we're just going to shift that from 11 to 11:10. The food in the back is actually for lunch, so please don't touch that. But if you'd like to stand up, talk to your neighbor, get some water, kind of speak to each other as well about your thoughts on the index, on how the day is going, and just feel refreshed. And I will see you at 11:10. Thank you. Morning again to everyone. If you could take your seats now. I hope you've enjoyed your conversation. It's been really good to meet many of you, and I hope to meet more of you after the next presentation. And once again, thank you all for being here. Just going to give everyone a moment to settle in. So as I noted earlier this morning, there's just a great panel lined up. You've heard from the Nuncio, Archbishop Cacha, you've heard the release of the 2022 Pope Francis Poverty Index, which both have been interesting, inspirational in the advocacy we do, and really reaffirms what I said we are here to do, to advocate for a better world. And someone I know who does that incredibly well is Mr. Bill O'Keefe, who I'm very happy to introduce to you today, who has come up from Baltimore, from CRS headquarters, and as Catholic Relief Services Executive Vice President for Mission and Mobilization. Bill O'Keefe oversees CRS's efforts to build a movement of Catholics and others of goodwill to support CRS's global mission and build action-oriented global solidarity with poor, vulnerable, and marginalized people around the world. These efforts include, but certainly are not limited to, lobbying Congress and the administration on a range of foreign policy issues and engaging U.S. Catholics in public campaigns to change U.S. foreign policy in ways that promote justice and reduce poverty overseas, the very poverty that we're speaking about here today. Mr. O'Keefe received his Bachelor of Science, cum laude, from Yale University and a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government, after which he joined CRS in 1987, first project managing in Tanzania, has held several roles since then, and most recently was appointed, as I said, Executive Vice President for Mission and Mobilization in 2019. So everyone, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Bill O'Keefe.
Thank you so much, Brianna. And it's really an honor for me to be here. I'm incredibly excited to be with you on this World Day of the Poor to reflect together on the signs of the times captured by the Pope Francis Index. Frankly, for those of us who follow Catholic social teaching, every day should be a day for the poor. And because a core principle of Catholic teaching is to have a preferential option for the poor. We shouldn't have 364 days for the rich and one day for the poor. And I know you're all committed, as am I, to try to reverse that over time. Recently, we at CRS have also been recognizing that the 3 C's of climate, conflict, and COVID have combined to greatly aggravate human suffering, displacement, hunger, and poverty. Next slide, please. We've added a 4th C, costs, to reflect the inflationary pressure that pandemic-related supply chain and Russia's war in Ukraine have brought to energy, fertilizer, and food prices around the world. The collective impacts of these 4 C's have reversed long-standing trends, positive trends in global poverty and hunger. Much of this has been documented in the Fordham Francis Index. But if we're to see an upward trend in that index in the coming years, we need to address these root causes. We can't attack the symptoms, we have to address the causes. Many of us particularly, I guess, in my generation, which I'm sort of at the very beginning of the baby boom generation. I'm mildly embarrassed to say because we've messed up the planet pretty severely. But we've been lulled, I think, a lot of us into a sense of the inevitability of human progress. We believed and observed that the arc of history appeared to bend toward justice, or at least was making steady progress towards better material livelihoods for most people. In fact, there are hundreds of millions of people who were lifted out of poverty since the 1990s. Extreme poverty rates have fallen more than half since 1990. Maternal mortality rates have dropped significantly. Until recently, as our colleagues explained earlier, hunger had been steadily reducing for decades. Clearly, though, we can't count on those gains continuing, especially if we don't deal with climate change. And I'm so glad that we're having this session with students and younger people who are going to have to both live with and solve the issues of climate change that we are all facing. I'm going to focus my remarks on the relationship between climate and the 7 basic needs captured by the Fordham-Francis Index. First, I just want to share a little bit of background about Catholic Relief Services. This is a paid advertisement. I am paid, so I have to give you this advertisement. But, you know, CRS is the Relief, Development, and Social Justice Organization of the American Catholic Community. Since 1943, we have been providing a range of support to communities around the world. Right now, we are in 110 countries and are serving 192 million people a year. Next slide, please. I also want to give a little background on integral human development, which I think might answer some of the questions that came up in the previous discussion. Because both the Fordham-Francis Index and CRS are heavily informed by and based on the concept of integral human development. So in our kind of graphic of integral human development, people are endowed by their creator with assets, a set of assets. All of us have strengths, different strengths. We're all different, but we're all equal in our dignity before God. We have spiritual aspects, human, social, political, financial, natural, and physical. But we exist in systems and structures. The more assets we have, the more access we have to the systems and structures around us. The less assets we have, the more the systems and structures impact us, and we have less agency. So that's why one of the things I like about the Fordham-Francis Index is it's measuring the assets, but also kind of the access to structures. Education, for example, it's clear in this country and around the world, particularly of girls, provides access to the systems and structures that allow for human development. Next slide, please. So around the world, communities are experiencing the effects of climate change, rising temperatures, longer and more extreme droughts, more intense rainfall. In our own country, we've witnessed the consequences of climate change in the United States as increasing and more severe wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, and maybe even like in a couple of hours, we're going to have another tropical storm coming by. So I think there's an increased consciousness, even in our own country, which is the last country to accept the reality of climate change. But our own experience is beginning to make a difference. Despite contributing the least to climate change, communities affected by poverty are the most harmed by its impact. They often lack the basic infrastructure and support to help them overcome the devastation caused by climate change. People lose their crops, their homes, their clean water, and they struggle to recover. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si', connected the plight of the planet and the plight of the poor and called us all to care for creation and the poor. He, more than any other world leader, has recognized this intimate connection. And that's part of why I think Archbishop Kusher laid it out so eloquently earlier. It's why the church has so much to offer at the United Nations and in these debates. We can't just talk about the environment and we can't just talk about poverty. We have to talk about it all together. It's not an exaggeration to say that everywhere CRS works, when we talk with farmers, they will tell us how the climate has changed. They don't debate the politics of dealing with the problem. They simply say that the farming methods their parents and grandparents used no longer work. That the rains that predictably came every year no longer do. That it's either too wet or too hot or too dry. They talk about new pests, lower yields, floods, and droughts. They face an uncertain future not of their own making. And the Fordham-Francis Index captures that reality. Next slide, please. This year's index documented aggregate improvements in access to water. Unfortunately, that progress is incredibly uneven, and I love the map that shows the heat map, or which is an apt term, the heat map here in our climate world. Climate change is driving most of that variability. Okay, good. Climate change is driving most of that variability and the most extreme cases. Access to clean water directly relates to infant and child mortality and economic vitality. Prolonged drought in the Horn of Africa caused failed harvests and mass livestock deaths. According to the UN, up to 26 million people are expected to face or are already facing acute food insecurity at the crisis level or worse. That's an IPC 3 or 4 or 5. In Somalia, in eastern and southern Ethiopia, and in northern and eastern Kenya. Access to water, though, relates to livelihoods and health. Next slide, please. This is Lokuku Samal Morwida. He's 55, he's the father of 6, and he's from Turkana County in northern Kenya. Every day, he walked for 2 hours to take his 3 camels and his goats to grazing lands in the hills, and then brings them to the water point before he goes home. He recently told a colleague of mine, the last time we had rains was during the locust invasion in 2019 and 2020. There have been no rains at all after that, and there's no grass for our livestock. There are no crops and grass, and our camels and goats do not have much to eat. They're eating seeds that fall from the trees and dry leaves, but these are not adequate and our animals are dying. I have only 3 camels left after more than 100 died due to the drought. I feel very sad. I'm waiting upon God to send us rain. Next slide, please. In Turkana County, CRS implements a range of programs helping communities adapt to climate change and become more resilient. Interventions include rehabilitating water systems like this and building water points, constructing latrine blocks, delivering livestock feed supplements and disease surveillance and basic water, and working with county government structures and systems to introduce water-saving agriculture. Next slide, please. The Fordham-Francis Index also documents the reversal in progress on global hunger. As I mentioned earlier, communities across the world are experiencing life-threatening levels of hunger and malnutrition. Families are struggling to meet their food needs. Food inflation has put people under tremendous strain. Supply chain interruptions, which are definitely messing up prices here, are having a much greater impact in many other places of the world that have already less efficient supply chains than we do here. Half the country of Afghanistan is at risk. And while food assistance must be scaled up, appeals from the United Nations are, commitments to appeals are at an all-time low. The globalization of indifference has spread to the generosity of governments in responding to these appeals. This is Hawa Ibrahim. She's a mother of 7, and she is also suffering under a devastating drought that has affected most regions of Somalia. She lives in a displaced persons camp with her 7 children, one of whom is blind. Their journey to the camp was torturous. She said, we traveled using a donkey cart walking 2 days and 2 nights before arriving at the camp. We were thirsty and hungry, and the donkey carrying our belongings died of starvation. We were forced to borrow another donkey to carry our luggage. And that's going to be it here. Next slide, please. This young child is, just a second. There we go. There we go. Yeah, this young child is being measured for malnutrition. This is a young Somali boy, and his arm is being measured in Baidoa in a hospital, and this actually occurred in just September of this year. The red mark there on the scale indicates that the child is severely malnourished and needs additional food and care. Somalia faces an unbelievable hunger crisis right now. There have been 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons, obviously combined with conflict, political instability, but climate change and the drought are just have taken all the coping mechanisms from communities there. And so everything we can to help. We're supporting 70,000 people affected by the crisis with healthcare, nutrition services, cash assistance, and clean water and hygiene supplies. In our response, we and our partners are prioritizing localized cooperative approaches that enhance social cohesion. I really like, Archbishop, your comment about that the Holy Father is not asking us to do for, but to do with. This idea of strengthening local institutions, empowering them to take responsibility and leadership is something we take very seriously. And for those of you in IPAD and in other development programs, is a really critical trend right now in international development. I could talk on and on about it, but it's not the topic of this talk. Next slide, please. Afghanistan, we all have read about Afghanistan, the US pullout, the various political and economic challenges to the country, but there's also a drought there, particularly in the western part of the country. And there's a paradox in Afghanistan right now that there's greater access than we've had in 20 years since the beginning of the war, because there's not a war going on. And that has allowed us to see with much greater focus the impacts of climate-induced drought and the human suffering that results from it. Afghanistan faces an IPC Phase 5 situation within its borders for the first time in its history. Conditions there are dependent on many different things, but climate change is an underlying driver of the experience. Next slide, please. Climate change and the increased severity and frequency of natural disasters impacts whether and how families and communities live in safe and dignified housing as well. This is Maria Eden Bellin. She's 49, and with her husband, they put up this makeshift shelter using salvaged wood and iron sheets from their home that was destroyed by Hurricane Goni in the Philippines. Most of their belongings and things were destroyed. She washes other people's clothes to earn money while her husband drives a tricycle. They're saving up to build a new home for their family because when Typhoon Goni, also known as Super Typhoon Raleigh, slammed into the southern part of the Philippines, Luzon Island, in November, they lost everything. Sierras Philippines and partners of Caritas and the Social Action Center there assisted families affected by the typhoon. We worked with shelter engineers to design appropriate housing using local materials and a locally appropriate way so that Maria and her family could build their own house. Next slide, please. Climate change also impacts employment in many complicated ways. As I've covered already, climate change and climate-related disasters can destroy farms, which is the main source of employment in many of the countries where Zero is working, and also destroy small businesses. But adapting to climate can also generate new and better sources of income. Before joining the Work Ready Now and Be Your Own Boss program, which is a CRS youth-oriented entrepreneurship project funded by the US government, Hawe Haua, a 26-year-old mother in Niger, was barely surviving raising chickens. However, now she had been nourishing for a long time, actually, a passion for plant nursery growing. When her father was alive, she explained he owned a nursery where he produced and grafted plants, and she used to help him whenever she could as a young girl. So when she was selected in July 2020 to be a part of this program, which offered young people training in agriculture, she knew exactly what she wanted to pursue. She decided to have her training in plant nursing and grafting. She was the only woman out of 9 participants in this field area. But during her training with the International Crop Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, she learned grafting. She assisted with natural regeneration, compost, and seedling production techniques. She learned how to adapt to climate change in her local area. This project is helping to reduce unemployment while also helping people to adapt to climate change. Next slide, please. The overlap of countries in the Fordham Francis impact and the impacts with the overlap of countries facing the impacts of climate change is very high. If you took those same world maps and did a heat map of the change in heat and overlaid that on top, you would see a very close correlation. The connection also to the spiritual elements of the Fordham Francis impact and climate change is also evident to us. Education is a critical, next slide, please. Yes, thank you. Education is a critical component to responding to climate change. The Fordham Francis Index reported increases in adult literacy, which of course is good news, but it is not enough. Races Ahuapan, a 12-year project from CRS El Salvador, in partner with Caritas El Salvador and other partners, worked with smallholder farmers to help them survive drought, restore their plantations, to improve their soil and renew their ecosystems. The program provides technical training to local producers on water-smart agricultural practices. The project has a strong youth component that brings opportunities, education, and employment for youth who are restoring over 12,000 hectares, which is, I think, about a couple of acres of agricultural landscape and the development of social economy for agriculture. This is Adriana. She's 17. She's a student from the National Institute there. She talks about her parents being farmers and how proud she is because now it's she who is teaching them new ways of doing agriculture. This agriculture high school has attracted many rural youths interested in new agricultural techniques that are preserving the environment. Next slide, please. I want to just quickly respond to the question that somebody asked about why gender equity has dropped. And at least from our perspective at CRS, the COVID crisis had a lot to do with that. And we actually saw this in the United States, that particularly women living in vulnerable households in situations of domestic abuse, when trapped in those households with those same abusers, faced much greater difficulty. Also, frequently, as our child care system collapsed, more or less, it was women who took themselves out of the labor force to take care of children. And many of these same impacts have happened overseas. Even though many countries were, because of the state of their public health system, unable to document that COVID, whether or not COVID came through and how serious it was, governments held lockdowns, and in those lockdowns, vulnerable women faced the same problems that they did here. That's what we saw and why we at CRS how we would interpret the declining indicators that were presented earlier. Let me just say, though, that, you know, across the world, women depend more on, yet have less access to natural resources. They bear a disproportionate responsibility for securing food, water, and fuel. Agriculture is the most important sector of employment for women in low and lower middle income countries. And during periods of drought and erratic rainfall, women as agricultural workers and procurers have to work harder to secure income and find resources for their families. This puts added pressure on girls who often have to leave school to help their mothers manage the increased burden. This is Celia, and she is a member of a CRS-supported community watershed project in Lesotho. She helps with land management and said one of the problems that she runs into is people grazing their animals where they're not supposed to. That's a big environmental problem in many countries of the world where that have a strong pastoralist tradition. She helps with rounding up the wandering animals, and then through a community agreement in this project, she impounds them and ensures that the offending owners pay a community-determined fine, which is 50 cents per sheep and 60 cents for impounding the animals. Where she lives is one of 6 areas in Lesotho where CRS works with partner organizations to improve the environment through land restoration and natural resource management. The end goal is that communities adapt to climate change and further food security, but also that women in the community watershed teams take leadership for this process. Leaders of these community watershed teams are elected and trained on land restoration and natural resource management, and they bring that knowledge back to their communities. Next slide, please. I want to just give a little example on the issue of religious freedom. Religious freedom is a larger issue than, and mainly in many cases, a political and cultural one that CRS doesn't necessarily directly work on. But in the Sahel in West Africa, and I'm talking here about the countries of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, it is a huge concern. And it's a huge concern for us at the local level, the coexistence of Christians and Muslims who lived closely and worked together and intermarried for many years, and now are being riven apart by a range of factors, including climate change. And I just want to talk about that for a second. You know, the Sahel is living through an unprecedented period of violence. This is, you know, I don't know, so many people don't even know what the Sahel is. And I have this kind of frequent conversation with our team in Burkina Faso, which we have the most incredible group of people there, Burkinabe, who are just so committed to their country and such good people. But they always say, why can't Americans care more about Burkina Faso? When I have to tell them the bad news, because they don't even know what it is. I mean, like Burkina Faso, for most people, it could be a disease. It could be, I mean, it just doesn't exist. Our knowledge of geography of inland West African states of your average American is very bad. And so the Sahel, what is the Sahel? Many people do not know what the Sahel is. They do not know that in Burkina Faso, there are 2 million displaced people there. I was in Burkina Faso in May and June. I met with the bishops of those 3 countries, and we talked about a project that CRS is supporting them on called the Sahel Peace Initiative. There are 3 elements to it. 1, helping the church respond to the humanitarian needs caused by all this displacement. 2, helping the church to work with their with other religious leaders, Muslim religious leaders at the community level and national level to build social cohesion and to build resilient communities that are less likely to fracture when extremists come in. And the third thing that we're doing is trying to strengthen the voice of the church and the bishops in order to address the root causes of the problem. And this is where I get to climate change. These are societies that, you know, again, most people are agriculturalists and pastoralists. as climate change has made land less fertile, has made raising cattle more difficult, the struggle over resources has resulted in these kinds of community conflicts. Those conflicts sometimes get portrayed as being religious as in nature, but usually it's elites who are using these divisions for their own purposes, and they're doing so in an environment where these root causes make it easy for them to do so. So we are working with the church to try to address those root causes over time. And we hope, at least for those countries, the result will be an improvement across the Fordham-Francis Index. And I'd love to see a little, like a regional breakout for the Sahel and for the Horn of Africa. It'd be really interesting to kind of, we could have more specific discussions. That's a good idea. Henry, take note. Okay. Next slide, please. So I've kind of, I'm standing up here and I'm thinking I'm kind of laying on heavy here with some not super great news about climate change and its impact and it as a driver of the Fordham-Francis Index declining numbers. And I'm actually an incredibly hopeful and positive person, so I don't intend to do that. And I'm going to try to give you some sense of agency and action. I'm going to start with talking around COP27. So I know all of you know, particularly the young people in this room, that there is the committee, the 27th Committee of Parties is going on at a super bizarre resort in Egypt. And I went to that resort one time for a CRS meeting. There's like 20 of us talking about global hunger, global poverty, and thousands of drunk Russians. It was the weirdest thing. And and now there's a climate conference there. Whoever thought that was a good idea, I don't know, but it's super important. And it's important because that's where governments hopefully will agree to take some steps to further address climate change. CRF has a delegation there. Caritas International has a delegation there. The broader Catholic Church is taking leadership after the vision of Pope Francis on addressing and getting governments to address the root causes of climate change. CRS is advocating and advancing at COP27 a couple of things I just want to mention. One is robust funding for climate adaptation. The rich countries are not meeting their targets and commitments on climate adaptation and mitigation, and they're doing worse on adaptation than mitigation. They are not doing enough to help the most vulnerable people in the most vulnerable places adapt to the inevitable changes of climate change. That's our first point. Second is, we want these governments to address the issue of loss and damage. Who knows what loss and damage is? Okay, quick parenthetical remark here. Loss and damage, adaptation is helping people adapt. Loss and damage is compensating them for what they've lost. If you're a fisher person who survives on fish that live on a coral reef, and the reef dies because of climate change, you can't adapt. You're sort of like, you've lost it, it's gone. So the principle is that those of us who cause this climate change, those governments that cause this climate change, should be compensating or making up in some way to be determined for that loss that's happening in very discrete places all around the world. And we are advancing this idea, which is a moral and ethical question and a practical question, and urging governments to do so. We want climate finance to be additive and in the form of grants, not loans. Ensure countries are at the center of their decision-making. As Pope Francis says, we want to put the periphery at the center so that the poor, vulnerable countries are at the center of these conversations. And some other kind of more technical provisions I won't get into right now. Next slide, please. Lots of stuff going on at CRS. I don't have time to go through all of this right now, but what I want to focus on is there's just 3 pieces of climate action. One, At the top, our own mitigation, figuring out how to lower our carbon footprint. We're getting help and partnering with Villanova University. I know we have a number of folks from Villanova. Thank you, incredibly helpful. Second, we are adapting our programs so that we are supporting more climate smart programs and more climate adaptive programs. And then finally, we are doing policy and advocacy on the root causes of climate change. Next slide, please. On October 4th, CRS launched a new climate campaign in the United States. The campaign aims to engage Catholics and others of goodwill in concrete measures that make a difference. We are trying to change a number of policies of our government, starting with, depending on what happens with these midterm elections, I know we just had them, but we don't know the results, building a bipartisan consensus that more needs to be done. That's going to be super hard work, but we are committed to do it. We are also advancing something called the Global Food Security Act, which is provides for better, more climate smart agriculture around the world, and a number of other steps that I could talk more about, but we'll skip right now. Next slide, please. I believe that the arc of history does bend toward justice, but that requires people to bend it. And I think that there's this misconception of many of our people in the United States that, as I mentioned at the beginning, the sort of inevitability of the various forces that are out there, either are political or economic, nothing is inevitable. It all depends on actions that individuals, families, and communities take that make a difference in the long run. That's the arc of history. We have to bend the arc of history, and we have to bend the arc of history around climate change. It's up to us. We have to care for creation and care for the poor, and make sure that those two cares enervate our politics and our economy. It's the responsibility of those most responsible for climate change to support those countries least responsible for it. Many of the CRS projects I talked about are funded by the US government. We want them to fund more of these sorts of things, not so much for CRS, but for everybody. And you have the opportunity right now, should you desire, to participate in this. And all you need to do is text 677-68 and type in climate change, and you'll get an opportunity, an action alert to immediately advocate for additional funding for climate and other issues that support addressing global poverty. Hopefully next time we gather, the Fordham-Francis Index will tell a more positive story of integral human development and our progress towards it. To do so, we'll need to address the impacts of climate change more seriously, reduce conflict, and address the macroeconomic and other issues raising from COVID. Next slide, please. I want to just, I did not coordinate with Archbishop Caccia, but I want to finish too often we participate in the globalization of indifference. May we strive instead to live global solidarity. And that's my final message. I want to thank you all. And I think we have time for some questions. So thanks so much.
Time for Q&A, and I think we have one microphone there. I have one here as well. Oh, you have one as well. Okay, we've got plenty of microphones. So if there's any questions for Bill, comments.
There's a question.
So you mentioned that in recent years, on the whole, international aid from wealthy nations has decreased. What do you think are the driving causes of that? And what nations have you seen the greatest decreases in?
So that's a great question. And of course, it's a complicated answer country by country, but I'm going to put it down to three things. One, European nations are focused on European things. And the war in Ukraine is European thing number one. And so a number of countries are actually counting their assistance to refugees coming in as development assistance, which from our perspective is a definite technical foul. You know, that's cheating, it doesn't count. But they are, and of course they have real needs, but it's problematic. So European countries generally have pulled back. The UK, which used to be a European country and now is a European country geographically, but is no longer in the EU, and was one of the most generous countries, one of the countries that had made a commitment and lived up to it to get to the SDG commitment of 0.7% of their budget going towards international assistance. Because of political issues there, they have stepped way back from that commitment. And so, and that's a very short summary of a very big and long problem. But the UK, which we relied on, I think the community in very significant ways has really kind of stepped back. I think many people would say that we also have an issue of racism, that the countries that are getting help, like Ukraine, the generosity of our own country and other countries, it's just not equal. You know, I mean, Afghanistan is getting, you know, the U.S. is being very generous in many different ways, but if you do a little comparative analysis, it's pretty clear that that there's some real differences, and so many. And the question of Europe too, and I'll just say quickly, I'll never forget. And that some of you there is this thing called a landline, and we used to have them at the office. And whenever there was a huge emergency or disaster at CRS, there was no internet, there was no computer. Everybody had to answer the phones. And so in the early 90s, the Bosnian war is going on, and and everybody is answering the phone in the whole organization, because people are so generous and they want to help. I pick up the phone and there's an elderly woman and she says, I saw on TV, they look like me, I want to help. And what struck me was, it was just so, I mean, it's so natural in a way, of course, but I wondered if she had expanded her sense of me, who is like me, and if that was and if she defined it broadly enough. And I think we still have that problem. And that's what the solidarity of indifference comes in part from that. Who is the we? And the we's got to be all of us. So anyway, it's a long answer. Other questions?
I've got one. Thank you for the insightful presentation. I'm trying to understand if maybe you could give us a little overview just on this is this big story and it's a kid on actually convincing governments to change their policy.
Yep. So my job is to convince the American government on climate change, not all the governments. We are and because we're guests in the countries where we're operating, generally, you know, we're not telling those governments what to do, although our partners are, our Caritas partners and the bishops and the Catholic churches. So I can really only talk directly about the United States. And if you're asking me, I'm not going to boast of any wonderful success in getting the United States government to do more on climate change, except for, I will say this, we were a part of funding the green climate change during the Obama administration and kind of pushing, which wasn't easy. I mean, it's easy for the administration made the commitment, but getting that through the Congress was very difficult. We play, I think, a particularly critical role as the church in building bipartisan consensus, because we can and do talk to Democrats and Republicans. Many groups, particularly environmental groups, only deal with Democrats, in all honesty. And I think because the Catholic community is both Republican and Democrat, CRS's donors are both Republicans and Democrats. We can and do work with both. I've seen in the Congress, while I can't point to too many like super victories, I can point to there are many more members in bipartisan climate caucuses and many more Republicans who you can sit down and have a conversation that starts with, I just want to tell you what I just saw in Burkina Faso and the impact of climate change, and have them take that in. And I think that's really a sign of progress. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. Saw another hand.
Mentioned the importance of projects that build community capacity and that build social cohesion at a local level. I was wondering if you could talk about what CRS's strategies and approaches are to ensure that the resources and the funding it brings are directly getting in the hands of local communities and not stakeholders who would use that money to show their own position.
Yeah.
Inequalities.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think our strategy is accompaniment and presence. And what I am, and it probably sounds kind of mushy, whatever, but the main point is we are supporting institutions like Caritas that have been in X country, X village for decades. And so they know actually who are the legitimate leaders and who are the ones that are positioning themselves for resource capture. As a kind of different example, but to me an interesting one, was Afghanistan during the various military groups, including the American military, out of, I think, a humanitarian impulse, wanted to do a lot of kind of hearts and minds projects. What we saw was they would come in, if you come into a village in Afghanistan and say, or anywhere and say, hey, I got a lot of money, who wants to work with me? The people who raise their hands are not the legitimate community leaders who are like, I gotta see what's gonna happen. I mean, I have to live in this community. I'm gonna wait and see what happens here. It's the ones who are like, ooh, I want some of that money. So for CRS to develop a program, it'll take a year, you know, in a place where we've already been. And that's what I mean by accompaniment and presence and relationship, is where we are able to discern who are legitimate actors and who aren't. I will also say that, you know, there's any donor money is so tied with so many, you know, requirements and measures and accountability strings attached. And it's we work extremely hard. And so really great question. And I think it gets to the heart of kind of, again, some of Pope Francis's wisdom around encounter and relationship as the basis for progress. One more question?
My name is Ray Ward. I'm from Cabrini University. Thanks very much. I wanted to follow up on this question about why commitments and donations to global poverty and support has gone down. I would think a big part of it too is countries are feeling threatened in their own economies. After COVID, the potential global recession on the horizon, people pulling back. I know we've had a lot of those conversations in the United States. Why help those people when our people need help? I was wondering, in your work in advocacy, what do you see as the kind of more powerful argument? Is the call of the gospel or the call of people's values what's going to overcome some of that self-interest? Or is enlightened self-interest? Is saying global poverty is a threat to everybody, that climate change is a threat to everybody. What are you seeing in your strategy?
Great question. The first part of your question, I will just say, in the United States, during the Trump administration, foreign assistance and the pandemic, foreign assistance went up. So in the United States, I think, and our donors, actually, our CRS donors, it was amazing when the pandemic first started, the executive team of CRS, we had these meetings and they were kind of like doom and gloom. You know, we got to close the office. How are we going to keep everybody safe? Blah, 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 blah. And then we got to harbor our cash because everything's gonna collapse, people aren't gonna give us money, whatever. Our donors who were experiencing climate change, who were experiencing COVID here, realize if it's bad here, I wonder what it's like in Uganda. I mean, we had paradoxically our best fundraising year to date during the COVID crisis. So I don't think it has to be that way. I don't. And I do, you're right, though, that certainly European countries, many countries have faced economic struggles, and I'm sure that is a factor. The arguments that work, I mean, I think it's different arguments work with different people. It's our job at CRS to do two things: to make a moral argument and believe it or not, members of Congress have consciences. They really do. I mean, I've met a lot of them, and I almost to a person, they're good people. And if taken out of the sort of these political dynamics that they find themselves in, they want to do the right thing. And so the trick is figuring out, how do I help them do what they know in their heart of hearts that they can do? How do I surround them with enough political support that they can do what they know? Because they of course they want to. I mean, if you're a member of Congress and you're sitting on billions of dollars and you can, tell your kid when you go home, I helped to end AIDS this week. I mean, they do actually want to do that. So that's point one. Point two is to talk about the experience and the examples to show that it can be done, that we can help communities and families. We can address these problems. We have to give them the vision and the hope that if we can get them to have the will, that they can see their way to it. So we don't necessarily make the national security argument. Those are good arguments, and there's a lot of polling of congressional staff and members about how, particularly on the Republican side, connecting ending poverty with national security is a good argument. That's not mine to make, that however effective it might be for some, but there you go. I want to thank, are you closing, Brianna? Yeah, thank you. I'm passing it to Brianna.
Okay, thank you everyone once again for being here. Is this on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So we started off the morning hearing from His Excellency Archbishop Kacha, who really laid out the groundwork for the World Day of the Poor, which, in case you did not know, is actually commemorated this Sunday. So we're celebrating here a little bit early in solidarity with one another. And I say celebrate because if you look at this room around you, I think we are doing what Bill has just said about members of Congress. We want to do good together. And I believe we have done good together in this room today as well. And like I said at the very beginning, and connecting that to now, while we are doing good, we want to advocate for a better world for all. And in the spirit of CRS, Fordham's IPED, and Caritas, we do that as one human family, and we do it for our common home. So thank you for being here to listen to the release of 2022's Pope Francis Poverty Index. Thank you for staying for the talk on climate change and the need for pathways for the poor. And thank you as well. I saw a lot of people take out their phones to text. It was just on the screen a minute ago. We can put it back up as well to text and take action today. So for those of you who have been here for the morning panel, there is lunch. For those of you students who are staying with us from CRS University chapters, there's also lunch, and we'll start our Young Careers panel at 1 p.m. I do want to thank especially all of the students in the room. You are surrounded by professionals in the field who are working at the UN, working in different countries day in and day out. And we hope to leave the world a better place for you, and also hope to have you join us in our own careers very soon. And so I'm really excited for the rest of the afternoon for those of you who are staying with us. And for those of you who have been with us all morning, thank you, thank you, thank you again. I know I sound like a broken record, but I really do mean it when I say it is so wonderful to see this room packed. It has been wonderful to work with Fordham, with CRS on this, and it has been wonderful to engage with you all this morning. So please enjoy lunch and do come and introduce yourself and say hello as well.